The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and money. Not the honest smell of work, not sawdust or engine oil, or the particular sharpness of a cold morning, but the sealed artificial smell of a room that had forgotten the outside world existed. The air conditioning hummed at a frequency that felt designed to make you smaller. The leather chair I sat in probably cost more than every vehicle I had ever owned combined, and I could feel that fact in the way it held me, cool and indifferent against the back of my neck. I had spent 40 minutes in the bathroom of a gas station 3 blocks away, trying to look like someone who belonged in a place like this. I had scrubbed my hands until the knuckles ached, had borrowed a comb from the attendant, and dragged it through hair that hadn't seen a proper mirror in weeks. It hadn't worked. My fatigues were clean, but worn thin at the knees. My jacket had a fraying cuff I kept tucking under the table edge. I sat with my spine straight the way the Army had taught me, because that was the one thing I still knew how to do without thinking hold myself like I deserved to take up space even when every other signal in the room said otherwise. Mr. Finch sat across the desk with the particular stillness of a man who delivered difficult news for a living. He was in his 60s, silver-haired with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, and a face that had learned over many years to reveal nothing it didn't intend to. His hands were folded on the desk. On the leather blotter in front of him sat two objects, a large old-fashioned key made of tarnished brass, and a thick cream-colored envelope with my name written on the front in handwriting I almost recognized. Nora. Just the one word. No last name. As if whoever wrote it had been certain I would know. Miss Calloway, Mr. Finch said, his voice measured and precise. I appreciate you making the trip. I understand it wasn't a short one. I said nothing. I had learned in the years since the Army that silence was often the most honest response available. Your grandfather, Walter Calloway, passed away 11 weeks ago. As I mentioned on the phone, his estate was modest. There are no bank accounts of significant value, no stocks, no traditional property holdings. He paused, letting the absence of those things settle in the room like furniture. However, he was very specific, very deliberate, I would say, about one particular item. He wanted it to pass directly to you and only to you. He slid the key across the blotter. It was heavy-looking even before I touched it. The kind of key you saw in old photographs, its teeth worn but still sharp. Attached to it was a faded plastic tag, the kind that had been written on with a permanent marker so long ago, the ink had partially bled into the plastic. The number was still legible, 217. Alongside the key, he moved the envelope. My name faced upward. That handwriting again shaky, deliberate, the loops of someone who had once had elegant penmanship and was working hard to keep it. He left you the contents of a storage unit, Mr. Finch said. Unit 217 at North Fork Storage just outside a town called Silver Creek. It's roughly 4 hours from here by road. The lease on the unit has been paid in full. He cleared his throat in a way that told me the next sentence was the one he'd been building toward. There is, however, a complication. The land on which the facility sits was recently purchased by a development corporation, Vesta Resorts. They have plans for the site. All existing leaseholders were notified of a termination window. Your grandfather's prepaid term will be honored, but you should understand at the end of that window, the facility will be demolished. How long, I said. 6 months from the date of his passing. He paused, which means you have approximately 4.5 months remaining. I looked at the key, I looked at the envelope. I did not reach for either of them yet. 4.5 months. I had been living out of a car for 7 of them. Before that, a series of transitional housing programs that had timelines and paperwork requirements and a particular kind of institutional patience that ran out faster than anyone admitted in the brochure. Before that, 3 years of trying to be a civilian and finding out that the word meant something entirely different than I had expected. There's also this, Mr. Finch said and nudged the envelope another inch toward me. He was very specific that you receive it at the same time as the key, not before. I reached out and picked up the key first. It was cold and heavier than it looked, the brass worn smooth in some places and rough in others, as though it had been handled constantly for years and then not touched at all. I pressed my thumb against one of the teeth and felt the edge of it sharp and real. Then I picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, my name in that careful, deteriorating hand. I held it for a moment without opening it. "Is there anything else?" I asked. Mr. Finch studied me over his folded hands. Whatever he saw, he kept to himself. "No, Miss Calloway, that is the entirety of it. I'm sorry for your loss." I put the key in my jacket pocket. I put the envelope inside my jacket against my ribs. I stood, straightened my cuffs out of habit, and walked out of the air-conditioned quiet of that office and back into the noise of the city. The sun hit me like a verdict. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment with my eyes closed, letting the light press against my eyelids. Around me, the city moved and rattled and exhaled diesel fumes in someone's radio, and the sound of a jackhammer a block away, dismantling something that used to be something else. I had $43 in my wallet. I had a key to a storage unit in a town I had never heard of. I had an envelope I was afraid to open pressed against the left side of my chest. I had for the first time in months somewhere to go. The bus station was 6 blocks east. The ride to Silver Creek took 4 hours and 12 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my phone the entire way, not because I was in a hurry, but because it gave me something to do with my hands other than reach into my jacket for the envelope. The bus was half full and smelled of disinfectant and something sweet and slightly rotten underneath it, the way public spaces often do when they're cleaned frequently, but never quite thoroughly enough. A child 2 rows back cried intermittently for the first hour, thin and rhythmic, then stopped. Outside the window, the city thinned and spread, and eventually gave way to stretches of highway flanked by fields, and then small towns that appeared and vanished in the time it took to blink. These were towns that looked like they had peaked in a decade no one currently living could agree on. Main streets with more empty storefronts than open ones. Church marquees with messages meant to comfort, but that read in passing like quiet desperation. A grain elevator with a rusted roof. A gas station with one pump missing its nozzle and another draped in a plastic bag. I recognized something in these places, not from memory exactly, but from the particular shape of being left behind. The particular silence of somewhere that the larger world had simply moved on from without announcement or apology. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and let the landscape move through me. My memories of Walter Calloway were not a story. They were a collection of sensations that surfaced without warning, disconnected from each other, refusing to arrange themselves into a coherent narrative, no matter how many times I tried. The smell of his workshop sawdust and linseed oil and the iron tang of old tools. The weight of a wooden mallet in my hand when I was too small to use it properly, and his voice behind me not correcting, just patient. The sound of a hand plane moving along a board, that long, clean whisper of blade against grain. His hands on mine adjusting my grip on a chisel. The particular roughness of his palms, which were not soft anywhere. He had told me once, I must have been 7 or 8, that the secret to good joinery was not the tool and not even the skill. It was the willingness to go slowly when everything in you wanted to rush. A good joint needs no nails, he said. If you're using nails to hold it together, you cut something wrong. Then he was gone. I was 9 years old, and one morning he simply was not there, and no one in our house explained it in any way that made sense. My mother said he needed to be on his own. My father said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. There had been a night of raised voices behind my closed bedroom door. My father's voice tight and strange, Walter's voice low and carrying something I didn't have the vocabulary for then. Pain, maybe. The particular pain of a person who has made a decision they know is wrong and is doing it anyway. 2 years later, my parents were gone too. A single vehicle accident on a wet road in November, the police said. I was 11. After that came the System Foster Placements group homes, a series of well-meaning strangers who provided the minimum and sometimes more than that, but never enough of the particular thing that was missing. I enlisted at 18 because it was the most direct available path to a life with structure and purpose, and people who would depend on me to be present and capable. I was good at the Army in the ways that mattered operationally. I was less good at it in the ways that no one talks about until it's too late. When I got out, I discovered that the skills which had made me useful over there translated into the civilian world as a kind of hypervigilance that exhausted everyone around me, including myself. The VA had waiting lists. The programs had end dates. Eventually, I stopped explaining and started managing, which worked until it didn't. $43, a key to a storage unit, a 4-hour bus ride to a town called Silver Creek. The bus pulled in at 4:17 in the afternoon. Silver Creek had one main street that I could see from the station, and it matched the towns I'd watched blur past the window: a hardware store, a diner with a hand-painted sign, a post office, a barber shop with the pole still turning a bar with two pickup trucks parked in front of it. The kind of town where everyone knew the sound of every engine. The kind of town where a stranger standing at the bus stop was a noticeable event. The gas station attendant on the corner told me North Fork Storage was about a mile out of town on the Eastern Road. I walked. My duffel bag was not heavy. It rarely was anymore because I had whittled my possessions down to the things that were genuinely necessary, and it turned out those things did not take up much room. The afternoon sun sat low and orange over the tree line. The air was different out here than in the city, denser, cooler. Carrying pine resin and something I eventually identified as a creek nearby, that clean green smell of moving water over stone. The facility appeared at the end of a long gravel drive, a collection of long, low metal buildings, painted a faded red that had been losing its argument with rust for at least a decade. A chain-link fence, a keypad at the gate that had cobwebs in the number keys. The small office at the entrance was dark and locked. A hand-lettered sign taped to the glass read, "Find your unit. Enter your unit number for the gate code. Please be out by 9 p.m." I punched 217 into the keypad. The gate scraped open. The rows of storage units were identical from the outside. Same corrugated metal doors, same rusted hasps, same strip of gravel between each row. 180, 190, 200. My footsteps on the gravel sounded too loud in the stillness. A crow called from somewhere in the tree line past the fence. The afternoon light stretched long shadows from the roof edges across the ground. Unit 217 was at the far end of the last row. I stood in front of it for a moment before doing anything. The door was the same faded red as the others, but the rust had progressed further here, crawling up from the bottom edge in that particular organic way that metal eventually surrenders to moisture and time. The hasp was thick with oxidation. The padlock hanging from it was a heavy-gauge steel lock pitted and dark, and it was not the kind of lock that the brass skeleton key in my pocket would open. I felt something drop in my chest, the sudden familiar weight of a thing that was not going to work out. Then I looked up. Above the door frame, tucked under the metal lip of the roof, overhang half hidden by a decade of grime and a small colony of spider webs, was a magnetic lockbox. The kind people attach to the underside of a car to hide a spare. It was so well camouflaged by dirt that I almost missed it. Almost. I reached up and pulled it free. It clicked open. Inside, nested in a small square of foam that had been cut precisely to fit, was a single silver key. I put it in the padlock. The lock was stiff, the internal mechanism fighting years of weather and disuse. I had to brace my foot against the bottom of the door and use both hands twisting until my wrists ached. Then something gave deep inside the mechanism, a solid, heavy click, like something that had been waiting a long time to let go. The bolt slid back. I gripped the ridged handle of the roll-up door and pulled. The door protested on its tracks, groaning upward with a voice of metal that had not moved in years. The darkness inside was complete for a moment, just the smell rolling out to meet me. I had braced myself for rot, for mildew and the particular sweetness of things that had been sealed too long, for the specific disappointment of a room full of broken furniture and forgotten junk. What hit me instead stopped me completely. Sawdust, linseed oil, the faint iron of old steel tools. I stood in the doorway, unable to move for several seconds, because the smell was not abstract. It was not the general smell of a workshop. It was his workshop. Exactly, precisely, unmistakably, the smell of a specific room in a specific house I had not entered since I was 9 years old, and my body recognized it before my mind caught up the way the body always does, with the things that mattered most before you had words for them. I reached for the light switch inside the door frame, not expecting it to work. It worked. A single overhead fluorescent tube flickered on, casting a flat, even light over the interior. The unit was approximately 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep. It was not cluttered. It was organized with a precision that would have been remarkable in any context, and was in this one something close to astonishing. Along the back wall, a wooden workbench stood solid and dark with age, its surface scarred with the marks of 1,000 projects. Above it, a pegboard hung with hand tools, arranged in careful order. Hand saws graduated by size chisels in a row, block planes and jack planes, and a shoulder plane I recognized from a specific memory. I couldn't quite locate their blades, covered with a thin film of protective oil, their wooden handles dark and smooth. Two large shapes stood covered with heavy canvas tarps. Cardboard boxes labeled in permanent marker were stacked against the left wall from floor to ceiling. A heavy wooden chest sat against the right wall, bound with iron straps. Its lock an old built-in mechanism that matched the brass key in my jacket pocket exactly. And in the center of the workbench, placed with the deliberateness of something left for a specific person to find, was a military surplus ammunition can, olive drab and latched shut, with two letters painted carefully on the lid in white paint. NR. My initials. I walked to the stack of boxes first, not because it was the logical place to start, but because I was not yet ready to open the ammunition can, and I needed to understand what kind of room I was in before I did. The labels were careful and specific: kitchen, reference books, winter gear, hardware sorted by type, seeds. Then lower in the stack, a box that made me stop reaching. Nora, aged 7 to 9. I pulled it down. It was lighter than I expected. I set it on the workbench and opened the flaps. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed at the edges, were things I had not seen in more than 2 decades and had stopped allowing myself to think about, because thinking about them led nowhere good. A small wooden figure, no more than 4 inches tall, roughly carved but precise, in a way that suggested a great deal of care had gone into the roughness. A soldier, or maybe a sailor, its paint chipped along the shoulder. A handful of flat, smooth stones, the kind you find in creek beds, selected for their shape. A battered paperback copy of a children's book I remembered the cover of, but not the title. And a photograph. It was a photograph of two people sitting on wooden steps. The steps of a workshop, I could tell from the edge of a door frame, and a strip of workbench visible in the lower corner. One of them was a child with a gap-toothed smile and something in her hands that was either a small chisel or a large screwdriver. The other was a man in his 50s with white hair beginning at his temples and forearms crossed on his knees, and a look on his face that was directed entirely at the child beside him. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at me. The lump that formed in my throat was not gradual. It arrived all at once, fully formed, the way grief does when it has been waiting a long time for the right door to open. I set the photograph down carefully on the workbench. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at the ammunition can. NR. I unlatched it. The lid came up with a slight resistance, the rubber seal still intact enough to create a soft pull. Inside, the can was packed with envelopes. Dozens of them, then more, stacked in tight rows and bound together with a piece of natural fiber twine. The same cream-colored paper as the envelope Mr. Finch had given me. The same careful, deteriorating handwriting on each one, each labeled with a date. The earliest date I could see was from August 2003. August 2003. That was the summer after he left. On top of the stack, one envelope sat slightly separate from the others, and on its face, instead of a date, 3 words were written. Read this first. I was still wearing my jacket. I reached inside and pulled out the envelope Mr. Finch had given me. I held one in each hand. Identical paper, identical handwriting, identical instruction in different phrasing. I sat down on the edge of the iron-strapped chest. The metal was cold through my fatigues. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly overhead. Outside, far away, the crow called again, and then there was silence. I opened the envelope from Mr. Finch. The paper inside was thick, folded in thirds. The handwriting was shakier here than on the outside, the effort of controlling it visible in the slight inconsistency of the pressure, some letters heavier, some barely there. My dearest Nora, if you are reading this, I am gone. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for a great many things, and I suspect that before you reach the end of this letter, you will understand why that apology is not a small or simple one. You were told that I left, that I walked away from your father and from you because I was finished with the situation, or tired of the struggle, or selfish, or some other version of the story that put the fault in my character and left yours intact. I need you to understand that that story was not accidental. I constructed it deliberately, and I told it to your father myself using words I chose specifically because I knew they would make him angry enough to stop looking for me. I said things that were cruel and untrue and designed to close a door permanently. I am not proud of it. I did it because I needed him to believe I was gone by choice, and I needed you to grow up in a house where that was the accepted truth. Here is what actually happened. Your father was in serious trouble, Nora. Not the kind of trouble that resolves with patience or good intentions. He had borrowed money, significant amounts of it, from people who did not accept late payments or partial repayments or explanations. I don't say this to diminish him. He was a man who loved his family and made decisions under a level of pressure I don't think any of us fully understood until it was too late. By the time I learned the full scope of it, the interest had compounded past anything he could realistically address. I sold my truck. I sold my best tools, not the ones you'll find in this unit, but the ones I had been using actively, the ones I had built my work around. I liquidated everything I could liquidate quickly without raising questions. It was not enough. The debt had grown past the point where a single payment would satisfy it. These were not men who wanted to be repaid. They wanted leverage. They had it. They made that clear. A car sat outside your mother's grocery store for 40 minutes one Tuesday evening and drove away without incident. A set of tires was slashed in the driveway. These were not accidents or coincidences. These were messages, and they were directed at your father through the people he would do anything to protect. He was terrified, and he was paralyzed, and he was in too deep to see a clean way out. I saw one. I went to the men who held his debt. I told them I would take on every dollar of it, and I would disappear completely. No contact with your father. No contact with you. No presence in your lives in any form that could be traced or used. In exchange, they would leave your family alone. They accepted because I was a more satisfying transaction than your father ever could have been, and because my absence removed the one resource they had been using as a pressure point. I went home and I said things to your father that I cannot write here. They worked. He told me to leave. I left. I want to be very clear about something, Nora. Every single day of the years that followed, I knew where you were. Not in a way I can fully explain, without going into details. I'd rather leave for the other letters. But I watched. I kept track. I knew when you moved schools, when you aged out of the system, when you enlisted. I was in whatever way was available to me present. I was just not allowed to make myself visible. What I am giving you is not an apology sufficient to cover what was taken from you. I know that. I am not offering it as one. I am offering it as a truth because you deserve the truth of your own story, and for too long it has been kept from you by my silence and by the version of events I needed the world to believe. There is more to tell. Most of it is in the other letters. Read them in order. The dates are on the front. There are 214 of them. They represent 22 years of the conversation I was not permitted to have with you out loud. Start from the beginning. Go slowly. I love you. I have always loved you. That was never the question. Walter. I sat with the letter in my hands for a long time. The fluorescent light buzzed. The crow had gone quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a truck moved along the highway, its engine a slow Doppler fade. I had carried the weight of his leaving for 21 years. Not loudly, I had not been raised in circumstances that rewarded loud grief, and the Army had finished the job of teaching me to compress emotion into something small and dense and manageable. But the weight had been there, the particular cold certainty of being someone who had been left without explanation, without even the dignity of a reason. I had arranged my understanding of myself around that absence, the way you arrange a room around a piece of furniture you can't move. Working with the constraint so long you eventually forget. It's a constraint and just think of it as the shape of the room. He had not left me. He had left everything so that I could stay. The anger I had stored in the coldest part of myself for 2 decades did not dissolve. Nothing real dissolves that quickly, but it shifted. Something beneath it cracked open. Something I had no name for immediately. Something that felt uncomfortably like grief, but was not only grief. It was something closer to the sensation of a knot you've been pressing your thumb against for so long, you've stopped noticing the pain. And then someone touches it differently, and suddenly you understand that the pressure you thought was management was just a different shape of the wound. I put the letter back in its envelope. I set it in the ammunition can at the front of the stack. I sat on the iron chest in the buzzing light for a long time without moving. Then my phone rang. The sound was violent in the stillness. I grabbed it from my jacket pocket. Unknown number. City area code. Same city I had left this morning. I answered. Miss Calloway. Mr. Finch's voice crisp and precise as it had been across his desk, but carrying something new underneath it, a tightness that had not been there before. I'm glad I reached you. I'm afraid something has come up and I felt you needed to know immediately. I waited. Vesta Resorts, the development corporation I mentioned, has invoked an emergency acceleration clause in the municipal storage agreement. There was an issue with one of their other projects, a delay in another county, and they've decided to fast-track the Silver Creek site to compensate. The legal mechanism is frankly aggressive, but it appears to be valid. A pause. All storage leases are being terminated effective 14 days from today. I looked at the rows of boxes, the ammunition can, the canvas draped shapes against the wall. You told me 6 months, I said. My voice came out flat the way it did when I was controlling something. I know, I'm very sorry. They're offering a nominal buyout payment for terminated leases. But the important thing for you to understand is that 14 days is not a negotiable timeline. After that, they take possession and the demolition proceeds. Do you know who made the decision? I asked. Who specifically on their side pushed for the acceleration? A brief pause. The representative who contacted my office was a man named Craig Mercer. He's listed as Regional Development Manager. He came in the morning after our meeting, Miss Calloway. The morning after. I said nothing. I realized the timing is... Thank you, Mr. Finch, I said. I'll have it cleared. I ended the call. I stood up from the chest. I stood in the center of the unit and turned slowly, taking it in from a new angle. The tools on the pegboard, the carefully labeled boxes, the ammunition can with 214 letters, the covered shapes I had not yet looked at, the chest with its iron straps and its brass keyhole that matched the key in my pocket. 14 days. I looked at my watch. It was 10 minutes past 5 in the evening. The gate closed at 9. That gave me less than 4 hours tonight. I pulled off my jacket, folded it once, and set it on the workbench beside the photograph of 2 people on a set of steps. I rolled up my sleeves. I found a box cutter hanging from the pegboard, the blade still sharp, the handle worn exactly to the shape of a hand that was not mine, but was close to mine in size. I started with the canvas tarps. The first one came off in a single pull, and underneath it was a canoe. Full-length cedar strip construction, the hull a deep amber where the varnish had yellowed slightly with age, but was otherwise perfect, the individual strips of wood running in long, clean lines from bow to stern. It was the kind of object that took years to build and was meant to last a century. I ran my palm along the hull and felt the smoothness of the surface, the slight give of the varnish, the solidity of the cedar underneath. It had not been used in some time. It had been maintained as though it would be used tomorrow. The second tarp concealed a motorcycle, a Triumph of Bonneville. I thought from the frame geometry and the engine profile, though, I'd need better light to confirm the year. It had been prepped for long-term storage with the deliberateness of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Fuel stabilizer oil change tires off the ground on stands, every chrome surface treated, every gasket sealed. A machine that had been put to bed carefully and completely waiting. I stood between the canoe and the motorcycle in the buzzing light of a storage unit in a town I had never been to in a state of mind I had no available word for. I thought about a man in his 50s, then his 60s, then his 70s, moving from town to town with these things, building a canoe in one rented space, maintaining a motorcycle through winters in another, writing letters he could not send, filing them by date, watching from a distance with whatever tools were available to him as a girl became a soldier, became a woman living out of her car, waiting for the right moment to hand her the map. I went back to the ammunition can. I took the stack of letters out and held them both hands, feeling the weight of 214 unsent years. I would start from the beginning. I would go slowly. But tonight I had work to do first. The first thing Nora did the next morning was find a truck. Not buy one, she could not afford to buy one. But Silver Creek was the kind of town where people still posted handwritten index cards in the window of the hardware store. And one of those cards belonged to a young man named Darby Foss, who had a 2003 Ford pickup with 140,000 miles on it and was willing to rent it by the day to someone who could prove they had a license and left a cash deposit. He was 19, saving for his first semester at community college, and he had the particular combination of eagerness and wariness that young people develop when they've been burned by trusting too quickly but haven't yet stopped wanting to trust altogether. I showed him my license. I gave him $40 cash, nearly everything I had as a deposit, and told him I'd pay the daily rate at the end of each day from the work I was doing. He looked at me for a long moment in the way people look when they're trying to calculate risk. Then he handed me the keys. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Clearing out a storage unit," I said. "Out at North Fork." Something shifted in his expression. "The one Vesta's taking over." "You know about that?" "Everybody knows about it," he said. "Vesta's been buying up land around here for 2 years. Storage facility, the old mill property, 3 parcels out on the Eastern Road." He paused. "You need help, I'm not doing anything until my afternoon shift at the station." That was how I got Darby Foss. He was stronger than he looked, and a better worker than most adults I'd supervised, which was not nothing. He showed up when he said he would move when I told him to move, and did not ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. We worked in the particular efficient silence of 2 people who have each, for different reasons, learned that talking during physical labor is mostly just delay. The first day we established a system. Everything that needed to stay came out of the unit and went into the truck, which went out to the land. Everything that needed to go to donation went in the back of Darby's own truck. The trash pile was, as I had expected from the moment I walked in, remarkably small. Walter had not been a person who kept things without reason. The land was at the end of an unmarked dirt road 4 miles east of town, past a curve where the paved road gave up and became something more honest. 5 acres that bordered the national forest on 2 sides, the tree line a wall of pine and oak that caught the morning light in a way that made the air inside it look different from the air outside. A narrow creek ran through the lower corner, its water clear over gray stones. I drove out on the first morning with the truck bed loaded and stood at the boundary of the property for a long time before unloading anything. Walter had been here. He had stood on this ground and decided it was the right ground. I needed to understand why before I started treating it like a staging area. The answer came to me gradually over the course of that first day as I made 3 trips back and forth and began to understand the topography. The land sat on a slight natural rise. The creek meant water. The national forest boundary meant that what bordered this property on 2 sides could never be developed, could never be sold, could never be changed into something else. Whoever built here would always be looking at trees, always be listening to water. Walter had not chosen this land because it was cheap, though it may well have been. He had chosen it because it was protected by something larger than any individual's desire to own or alter it. He had chosen it because no one could take the view. I set the workbench up first under a blue tarp I tied between four pine trees and hung the tools on a section of pegboard I'd propped against a sawhorse. It felt right to establish the workshop before anything else. It felt like something Walter would have done. Each evening I sat in the truck with a flashlight and read the letters. I read them in order the way he had asked, starting from August 2003 and moving forward. He had dated everyone precisely day, month, year, and the dates created a rhythm, some clustered close together when something had happened that he needed to process. Others spread weeks or months apart, the gaps telling their own kind of story. The early letters were the hardest to read, not because they were dramatic, but because they were not. They were the letters of a man trying to be matter-of-fact about something for which there was no appropriate tone. He wrote about the jobs, carpentry work in small towns across Tennessee and into Virginia, the kind of work where you showed up, did what was needed, collected cash, and moved on. He wrote about the particular loneliness of rented rooms, the sound of other people's lives through thin walls, the way he had started talking to himself in the workshop spaces he rented because the silence otherwise was too complete. He wrote about the books he was reading, technical manuals on timber framing, guides to off-grid water systems, a history of American vernacular architecture that he returned to so many times he mentioned it in at least 6 different letters. He wrote about me, not constantly, and not in a way that felt like surveillance. He wrote about me the way a person writes about something they are trying to hold at the right distance, close enough to see clearly, far enough not to distort. He had gotten access to school records through channels he never fully explained. He knew my grades. He knew I had joined the cross-country team in 8th grade and quit in 9th. He knew which foster placement had lasted longest, and reading between the careful lines, which ones had not been good. The letter from 2010 was the one I had to put down and walk away from. "I know you enlisted," he had written. "I found out the same week. I don't know how to feel about it. Nora, and that is the honest truth. I am proud of you in a way that I have no right to claim because pride requires presence, and I have not been present. But I am proud of you. The Army will teach you things you can use and things you will need to unlearn, and you are smart enough to know the difference even if it takes a while. What I am is scared for you. I hope you find peace over there. I hope you find something you can build on. I hope whatever you carry back fits in a bag you can actually lift." I sat outside the truck on the running board with the letter in my hand and the night air moving in the pine trees, and I thought about the particular cruelty of love that expresses itself entirely in silence, because silence is the only form available to it. Then I folded the letter, put it back in its envelope, and went to sleep in the cab. On the 4th day, I pulled the canvas tarps off the remaining covered items in the unit and found behind a row of neatly stacked lumber something I had not expected. It was a boat motor small outboard, still in its original crate, the crate sealed with a bead of silicone around the lid. On top of the crate, in permanent marker, for the canoe, "Break in slowly." I stood there for a moment with something pressing behind my sternum that was not quite a feeling I had a word for yet. Then I loaded it into the truck. Darby noticed everything, the way perceptive young people notice things when they're watching someone and trying to understand what they're seeing. On the 5th day driving back from the land, he asked me carefully what kind of person my grandfather had been. I thought about it for the length of a mile. "The kind who built things to last," I said, and didn't say much about it either way. Darby nodded as though that was a complete answer. Maybe for him it was. On the 6th day, I went to Aldridge Hardware on Main Street for a set of drill bits and some structural screws. The man behind the counter was in his late 70s with hands that carried the specific topography of someone who had done physical work for most of his life. Knuckle joints, thickened calluses, permanent. The fingernails of a man who had caught them in things over the years and kept going. His name was on the sign outside. He looked at the tools I'd brought in for reference on sizing and went very still. "Where did you get those?" he asked. "Storage unit out at North Fork," I said. "My grandfather left them to me." He looked up from the tools to my face. Something moved in his expression that I could not fully read, recognition maybe, and something older than recognition. "Walt Calloway's tools," he said. It was not a question. "I haven't seen those in 20-some years. Thought the world had swallowed them whole." He set the drill bit he'd been holding down on the glass counter carefully, as though he was placing something fragile. Walt was the best carpenter this county ever produced. People didn't always know it because he didn't advertise and he didn't stay, but the ones who paid attention knew. Every piece he made was honest. You knew it would hold. You knew him, I said. Knew of him more accurately. He came through Silver Creek twice that I can recall, once in the late 90s, once maybe 8 or 9 years later. Didn't stay either time. But he did work that people still point to. He paused. You're his granddaughter. Yes. He looked at me steadily for a moment. Then he reached under the counter and came up with a small paper bag already closed at the top, with my name written on it in handwriting I did not recognize. I stared at it. He left this here about 6 months ago, Mr. Aldridge said. In person. Said his granddaughter would come in eventually for supplies and to give it to her when she did. He pushed it across the counter. He didn't say when, just eventually. I took the bag. Inside was a single key, small, the kind used for a lockbox or a small padlock, not a door, and a folded note. The note said, third shelf back of pegboard left side. Push the board out from the bottom. Walter. I thanked Mr. Aldridge. I bought my drill bits and my screws. I drove back to the unit. The pegboard was mounted flush against the back wall of the unit behind the workbench. I had assumed it was fixed. It looked fixed the same as any pegboard in any workshop. I went to the left side and crouched down and pressed my palm against the lower edge and pushed. The board swung outward on a concealed hinge at the right side. Behind it was a space approximately 18 inches deep, running the full width of the pegboard. On the third shelf, a small metal document box sat locked with the key Mr. Aldridge had given me. I unlocked it and lifted the lid. Inside, packed tight and organized with the same methodical care that characterized everything Walter had done, was a collection of documents unlike anything I had expected to find in a storage unit in Silver Creek, Tennessee. They were not random papers. They were assembled, cross-referenced, annotated in Walter's precise hand in the margins. I sat down on the floor of the unit and went through them page by page. The earliest documents were from the late 1990s, photocopies of business registration filings for a company called Meridian Capital Lending, incorporated in Delaware, operating address, a suite number in Nashville, that I would later confirm corresponded to a mail forwarding service. Below it, a network diagram drawn by hand in Walter's handwriting, showing the structure of a lending operation shell, companies nested inside each other. Ownership obscured through multiple layers of registered agents. Money moving in patterns designed to look like ordinary commercial transactions and be anything but. Further in, documents from the mid-2000s. New company names: Broadstone Financial, then Crestmark Asset Management, then others, each one a successor entity to the previous. Each registered at the point where the previous one had attracted enough attention to require a new face. The same names appeared and disappeared across the corporate documents, sometimes as officers, sometimes as registered agents, sometimes in the footnotes of subsidiary filings. The most recent documents were dated 2022 and 2023. The company name at the top of these was Vesta Resorts, LLC. I sat with that for a long time. The same organization, the same people in different configurations wearing different names. The men who had held my father's debt in 1997 had not disappeared. They had reorganized, rebranded, and moved their operations into real estate development, which was a legal and extremely efficient way to do everything. They had always done: acquire assets, extract value, and move before anyone looked too closely. Walter had followed them for 22 years. Not chasing, not confronting, watching, collecting, building a record so complete and so carefully sourced that each piece corroborated the next. He had done this in whatever hours were left over from the work that kept him alive in rented rooms in small towns with no institutional support and no guarantee that any of it would ever matter to anyone but him. I thought about the letter, about what he had written and what he had not written in that first one. He had told me the truth about why he left. He had told me about my father's debt and the men who held it and the agreement he had made. What he had not told me, what I understood now, he had been saving for another letter. The right letter was that he had not spent the years of his exile simply surviving. He had been building a case. I went back to the ammunition can that night. I took out the sealed envelope at the very bottom, the one I had noticed on the first evening, but had not opened because it was marked differently from the others. Not a date. 3 words in Walter's handwriting, when you know enough. I held it in my hands in the dim light of the truck cab. I thought about what I knew. I knew about the debt. I knew about the agreement. I knew about the shell company structure and the 22 years of documentation in the metal box behind the pegboard. I thought about what I did not yet know, and I thought about the particular weight of an envelope that was clearly the last in a sequence, the one that completed whatever the others had been building toward. I opened it. The handwriting here was the shakiest of any letter I had read. This had been written recently, within the past year, maybe within the past months. The effort of legibility was visible in every line. Nora, if you found this one, you found everything else first. That's how I designed it. I needed you to know the full shape of things before you came to this part, because what I have to tell you here is the hardest part, and I needed you to have the context to hold it. Your parents' accident in November 2005 was not an accident. I had to read that sentence 3 times. The fluorescent lights of the truck's cab buzzed. The wind moved in the pines outside. The official report said black ice, single vehicle, no other cars involved. It is a reasonable explanation, and it was accepted without significant scrutiny. I believe it was accepted without scrutiny deliberately by people who understood that certain questions in certain counties do not get asked if the right people prefer they aren't. Your father had, in the time between my leaving in 2003 and November 2005, tried to do the right thing. I don't know all the details. I was watching from a distance, and my information was incomplete. But I know that he made contact with a federal investigator in early 2005. I believe he was providing information about Meridian Capital's operations. I believe this was discovered. The accident happened 8 months after his first contact with that investigator. I cannot prove this. I want to be completely honest with you about that. What I have in the box is not direct evidence of what happened to your parents. What I have is 22 years of documentation about an organization capable of it, with a history of it, and with reason to do it in exactly that moment. It is not the same thing as proof of their specific deaths, but it is the structure of truth that any investigator worth their salary could use to ask the right questions. I thought about going to the authorities myself. I thought about it for years. The problems were practical, not moral. My existence, my survival depended on a kind of invisibility that doesn't survive contact with law enforcement, even friendly law enforcement. I had no legal standing. I had no identity that was fully intact, having spent years in a gray area I won't detail here. And I was not certain for a long time that any authority in the state of Tennessee would treat this information as anything other than the ravings of an old man who had been living off the grid for 2 decades. I am giving it to you instead. Not because I am passing the burden to you, I want you to hear me say that clearly. Not because I expect you to do anything with it, but because you have a right to the truth of what happened to your mother and father, and keeping it from you would be the worst kind of cowardice in a life that already contains too many compromises. Do with it what you decide is right. If you want to put it in a box and never look at it again, that is a valid decision, and I will have no opinion about it from wherever I am. If you want to pursue it, the documentation in the box behind the pegboard is where you start. Everything is labeled. Everything is in order. I made sure of that. I love you. I loved your parents. I am sorry I could not do more. Walter. I sat in the truck for a long time. The night was very dark and very quiet. A light wind moved through the pines in a sound that was not quite silence and not quite language, but somewhere between the two. My mother and father had not died because of black ice on a November road. They had died because my father had tried belatedly and imperfectly and at enormous personal cost to do the right thing. And the organization responsible had reorganized and rebranded and was now called Vesta Resorts, and was planning to build a resort on the land where the storage unit stood, and their representative had visited Mr. Finch's office the morning after I had been given the key. The morning after. As if they had known, as if they had been watching for exactly this moment, the moment the unit would transfer to a living heir, the moment someone might actually look inside it. I thought about Craig Mercer and his shark smile, in his expensive suit, and the 14-day timeline that had arrived so precisely, so cleanly, as though it had been prepared in advance. I closed the letter. I put it back in its envelope. I put the envelope at the back of the ammunition can. Then I drove back to the unit and worked until the gate closed at 9. On the 11th day, I pulled up to the unit in Darby's truck at 7 in the morning and found a black SUV parked at the entrance to the facility. A man in a charcoal suit stood beside it holding a coffee cup, looking at his phone with the practiced relaxation of someone who is performing ease rather than feeling it. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of haircut that costs more than most people's groceries. When he heard the truck, he looked up and produced a smile that arrived too quickly to be genuine. "Miss Calloway." He walked toward me as I got out of the truck. "Craig Mercer Vesta Resorts, Regional Development. I wanted to come by personally, make sure everything was going smoothly with the timeline." I looked at him. I looked at his lapel. There was a small pin there, enamel blue and silver, a stylized V inside a circle. The logo of Vesta Resorts. But beneath the V, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was an older design, a remnant of an earlier iteration, the ghost of a different logo incompletely replaced. The letter M inside the same circle. Meridian. He was still talking. Something about the buyout payment, the demolition schedule, how much Vesta was looking forward to bringing economic development to the Silver Creek area. His voice had the texture of someone who had delivered the speech many times and had no particular interest in whether it was believed. I let him finish. "How much time do I have left?" I asked. My voice came out flat. 3 days, he said. "We're very flexible on the exact hour, of course. We just need the unit clear." "It'll be clear," I said. He nodded. Something moved in his eyes that was not warmth and was not quite calculation. Something in between, the expression of a man who is assessing whether a situation requires more attention than it's currently getting. "Is there anything you need from us in the meantime?" he asked. "Any support with the move?" "No," I said. I turned and walked to the unit. I rolled the door up. I heard him standing behind me for a moment longer than was natural, then the sound of his footsteps on gravel, then the SUV door closing, then the engine. I stood with my back to where he had been standing, and I kept my breathing even and my hands open at my sides. 3 days. The trunk of the ammunition can sat on the workbench beside the photograph. 214 letters, 2 decades of silence, 22 years of documentation, assembled by a man who had given up everything he had and then used the years of exile to build something that might, if handled correctly, matter. I looked at the empty unit. I looked at the tools loaded into the truck. I looked at the open door and the gravel drive and the sky above it, blue and indifferent and enormously wide. I knew what I was going to do. I had known, I suspected, since the moment I read the letter with the word accident in it and understood that the word was wrong. I closed the unit door for the last time. I snapped my own new padlock, bought at Aldridge Hardware 3 days ago, onto the hasp, then cut it back off immediately because the unit was empty and there was nothing left to lock inside it. The gesture was instinctive and slightly absurd, and I didn't care. I got in the truck. I drove to the land. The land was quiet in the way that places are quiet when they have been waiting. Not empty. Never empty. The creek moved in the lower corner. The pines shifted in the morning wind. A hawk turned slow circles above the eastern tree line. But underneath all of that, there was a stillness that felt intentional. The way a held breath feels intentional, as though the land understood that something was about to begin and was making room for it. I parked the truck at the edge of the clearing and sat for a moment without getting out. 3 days. Then Vesta would have their empty unit and their demolition schedule and whatever satisfaction Craig Mercer derived from a project proceeding on timeline. They would not have this. They could not have this. Walter had understood that before I did, had understood it years before the threat had a name or a face, had chosen this specific 5 acres on this specific boundary not because it was the cheapest available land in Silver Creek, but because it was the one piece of ground within reasonable distance that no private development interest could legally touch. The national forest boundary made it inviolable. Whatever was built here would stay. I got out of the truck. I stood at the edge of the clearing with Walter's blueprints in my hand unrolled and weighted at the corners with stones from the creek, and I looked from the paper to the ground and back again until the measurements began to make sense as physical space. The cabin was small, one bedroom. A main room that served as kitchen and living space combined a covered porch on the south side to catch the afternoon light. Nothing excessive, nothing that required more material than could be sourced locally or more skill than one person working steadily could acquire. Walter had designed it to be built by someone working alone if necessary, and every joint, every connection detail, every specification for lumber dimension and fastener type reflected that constraint. He had not designed a dream house. He had designed something achievable. I was coming to understand the most consistent thing about him. I measured out the footprint with stakes and string, moving around the perimeter with the measuring tape and adjusting the corners until the diagonals matched, and I had a true rectangle. The soil was good here, dense with enough clay content to hold a form without being so heavy it wouldn't drain. I had poured footings before in a different context in a different country, under circumstances where the point was not construction, but something else entirely. The mechanics were the same. You prepared the ground honestly, and then you committed to it. I started digging. The work was what it always is when you are doing it correctly, slow, physical, and completely absorbing. It left no room for the other thing I was carrying. That was, I suspected, at least partly why Walter had spent 22 years in workshops. Not because he had nowhere else to be, but because the work required a quality of presence that crowded out everything else, and sometimes crowding out everything else is the only mercy available. Darby showed up at 8 in the morning without being asked. He had a shovel over his shoulder and a paper bag from the diner, 2 coffees, 2 egg sandwiches wrapped in foil. "Figured you'd be starting on the foundation today," he said. I looked at him. "Mr. Aldridge mentioned you'd bought concrete mix," he said. "Wasn't a hard deduction." I took the coffee. "I can't pay you for today. I already owe you for 2 days." "You don't owe me anything," he said, which was not true but was said in the way that makes arguing the point feel like missing something. He set down the paper bag and picked up his shovel and looked at the stake perimeter. "Where do you want me?" We dug for 4 hours. Opal came by at 11 with a thermos of fresh coffee and a look on her face that said she was not going to explain herself or make a production of the gesture. She set the thermos on the tailgate of the truck, said the egg sandwiches from that morning were better warm, but she hadn't had time and drove back toward town before I could say anything beyond thank you. I had not asked for any of this. I had not explained myself to anyone in Silver Creek beyond the bare minimum that I was clearing a storage unit, that I was using the land. I had not told anyone about the letters or the box or the documentation behind the pegboard or what I was going to do with it. People here seem to understand in the way that people in small towns sometimes do, that a person who showed up and worked without complaint and asked for nothing was a person worth showing up for. Mr. Aldridge came by in the late afternoon. He parked his truck at the property line and walked over with the particular deliberateness of an old man who has learned not to waste motion. He looked at the excavated footing trenches at the stakes and string at the blueprints I had pinned to the tailgate with a board clamp. He studied the blueprints for a long time without speaking. "Walt's hand," he said finally. "Yes." He looked at the dimensions. He looked at the connection details. He nodded slowly in the way of a man confirming something he had already suspected. "He designed this for you to build yourself." "Yes." "Smart," he said. "Not a compliment exactly, more like an assessment. The footing depth is right for this soil. You'll want to key it cut a notch in the bottom of the trench, gives the concrete something to grip sideways." He pointed to a specific corner. "That corner's going to catch drainage from the slope. I'd add a perforated drain tile before you pour. I've got some in the back of the shop." He said it the way people say things when they are not offering help, but simply providing relevant information that anyone in the same situation would want to have. I understood the distinction. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once, looked at the tree line for a moment as though he was thinking about something else entirely, and then walked back to his truck. That evening, I sat at the folding table I had set up under the tarp and laid out everything from the metal document box. I had been through it twice already, once in the unit on the evening I found it, once the following morning, but I had been reading it then as a document of discovery, trying to understand what I was looking at. Now I read it differently. I read it as someone who had made a decision. The decision had not been dramatic. It had not arrived as a revelation or a moment of resolve. It had arrived the way most real decisions arrive, gradually, incrementally, through a series of smaller recognitions that accumulated until the conclusion was simply undeniable. Walter had spent 22 years building this record because he believed it could be used by someone with the standing and the means to use it. He had left it to me not because he expected me to pursue it, but because I was the person he trusted to decide correctly what to do with it. He had trusted me. That was the part I kept returning to. Not the money, not the land, not even the letters, the trust. The decision to leave this in my hands rather than destroy it or submit it himself in whatever compromised and legally murky way he might have been able to manage. He had believed I was capable of handling it correctly. I sorted the documents into 4 categories. The first was the corporate structure material, the registration filings, the ownership diagrams, the chain of successor entities from Meridian Capital through to Vesta Resorts. This was the skeleton. The second was the financial documentation, transaction records, account numbers, movement of money through shell structures and patterns that were consistent with money laundering at a scale significant enough to constitute federal violations. The third was the personnel file, which was the part that had taken Walter the longest to build. Names, dates, photographs where he had managed to obtain them, records of specific individuals appearing consistently across multiple entities over multiple decades. The fourth category I labeled in my own handwriting, simply parents. This category was the thinnest. It contained a copy of the official accident report from November 2005, which Walter had obtained somehow. It contained a single page of Walter's handwritten notes about the timing the federal investigator contacted the 8-month gap the accident. It contained 2 names circled in pencil, the investigator my father had contacted, and a name I didn't recognize beside the notation possible. CI handler unconfirmed. It was not proof of murder. Walter had been honest about that. But it was a thread, and it connected to a much larger and more thoroughly documented fabric. I drove to Knoxville the next morning. It was a 2-hour drive each way, and I made it in the truck which I had told Darby I needed for the full day. I had found the name of a federal criminal defense attorney through the public bar directory. Not a defense attorney in the sense of someone who defended criminals, but the kind of attorney who understood federal criminal procedure well enough to know what evidence looked like from the government side and how to present information in a way that would be taken seriously rather than filed and forgotten. Her name was Patricia Renner. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building near the federal courthouse. Her assistant had given me a 45-minute consultation slot on the basis that I had described the matter as relating to potential RICO violations and wanted to discuss how to present documented evidence to federal investigators. Patricia Renner was in her 50s, direct and entirely without the kind of performative sympathy that lawyers sometimes deploy to make clients feel their cases are being taken seriously before they're told nothing can be done. She looked at the documents I had brought. I had brought the full set organized and indexed, and she asked questions for 35 of the 45 minutes. At the end, she sat back and looked at me. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "My grandfather assembled it over approximately 22 years. I said, "He's deceased. He left it to me." She was quiet for a moment. "He had no legal background." "Carpenter," I said. "Mechanic, self-taught in most things." She looked at the index I had prepared. "The indexing system is good. I organized it. He assembled it." She was quiet again, looking at the corporate structure diagram. The chain from Meridian to Vesta is documented at every transition point. Everyone. Registration filings, dissolution dates, new entity formation dates, overlapping officer lists. It's all sourced to public records. He noted the source for each document. That matters, she said. Public record sourcing means it's admissible without questions about how it was obtained. She tapped the financial transaction section. This is where it becomes a federal matter. The money movement through the Delaware structures, if this is accurate, this is substantial. This isn't small scale. No, I said, it's not. She looked at me steadily. What do you want to happen? I had thought about this on the drive. I had thought about Walter's letter, his instruction not to let the anger consume me. I had thought about what I had said to Darby on the drive back from one of the runs to the land, that Walter had been the kind of person who built things to last and didn't say much about it either way. I had thought about Craig Mercer's lapel pin in the morning after visit to Mr. Finch's office in the 14-day timeline, and the particular confidence of people who have operated without consequence for long enough that consequence has started to seem like something that happens to other people. I want it submitted to the right people, I said. I want it handled correctly. I'm not looking for anything other than that. Patricia Renner nodded. FBI field office handles RICO referrals at the federal level. I can facilitate an introduction to an agent I've worked with who handles financial crimes. This level of documentation, they'll take it seriously. I can't promise you outcomes, but I can promise you it'll be received by someone whose job it is to act on exactly this kind of material. And the other matter, I said. I opened the fourth section of the binder. The accident. She read Walter's notes. She read the names. She looked at the accident report. Her expression did not change in any way that was readable. That's a different matter, she said. A cold case reopening is a different process. But, she paused, if the federal investigation into the organization moves forward and produces indictments, the scope of that investigation can expand. These things are connected. If the connection is established through other means, the 2005 incident becomes relevant. She looked at me. I won't promise you that case gets resolved. I won't promise you any of this does. What I will tell you is that the right people will have the right information. What they do with it is not something I can control. I know, I said. That's all I'm asking for. 3 days later, Patricia Renner called me while I was standing in the truck bed feeding lumber down to Darby on the ground. I stepped down, walked to the tree line, and answered. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had accepted the referral. An agent had been assigned. The preliminary assessment of the documentation was that it merited a formal investigation. That was all she could tell me. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, more than Walter had been able to accomplish in 22 years. And I understood that the difference was not capability, but standing, that the same information in the hands of a person who existed cleanly and completely in the legal world could move where it could not move before. I thanked her. I ended the call. I stood at the tree line for a moment with my hand on the bark of a pine tree, its surface rough and faintly warm from the afternoon sun. Then I went back to work. The walls went up slowly, the way walls should. I had milled the structural lumber from trees I had felled on the property itself, 3 large pines that needed to come down to clear the building footprint. Anyway, their trunks straight enough to produce dimensional lumber with the portable sawmill I had rented from a yard in Knoxville on the same trip I'd made to see Patricia Renner. The smell of fresh-cut pine in the morning air was something I had no category for, except right. It was the smell of a thing becoming what it was supposed to be. Darby learned fast. He had never framed a wall before, but he understood instructions and he understood geometry, which were the 2 things that actually mattered. By the end of the second week of building, he could read the blueprints himself and anticipate the next step before I told him. I told him he had good instincts for this. He said he'd been thinking about it. Mr. Aldridge came by twice more. He did not offer help in any explicit way. He observed and then he mentioned things, the drain tile in the one corner, the correct technique for cutting a bird's mouth joint where the rafters would meet the wall plate, the particular way you braced a wall section before raising it when you didn't have enough hands. He said these things, and then he left, and I used everything he told me. Opal sent food with Darby on the mornings he came from town. She never explained this, and I stopped trying to address it directly because addressing it directly seemed to make her uncomfortable in a way that stopping addressing it did not. The triumph started on a Saturday afternoon in the third week. I had been working on it in the evenings, an hour here and an hour there, learning the engine the way you learn any mechanical system by taking it apart carefully and putting it back together more carefully. The carburetor had needed cleaning. The plugs were due, the battery was dead and had to be replaced. But the engine itself was sound. Walter had maintained it with the same precision he applied to everything. When the engine caught and settled into its idle, a low, steady vibration that I felt in my sternum before I heard it clearly, I sat back on my heels and stayed there for a moment. I took it out that evening. The roads east of Silver Creek wound through the hills and long curves, the pavement good enough and the traffic light enough that you could open it up on the straightaways without thinking too hard about consequences. The air at speed was cold even in the afternoon warmth, and it hit my face and my hands and found its way through every gap in my jacket. I rode for 40 minutes without a particular destination, following the roads as they presented themselves. And at no point did I feel the way I felt in the car on the highway, that low-grade alertness that was never fully off, that perpetual monitoring of everything that could go wrong. I felt the road and the engine and the air and nothing else. When I came back, I parked the Triumph under the tarp beside the canoe and sat on the running board of the truck until the sky went fully dark. The stars here were different than city stars, more of them, and more present, the Milky Way, a visible smear across the center of the sky. I had not seen stars like that since deployment, and the memory that attached to them was complicated, but underneath the complication was the simple fact of the beauty of them, which persisted regardless of what was attached to it. My phone rang on a Tuesday 5 weeks after I had driven to Knoxville. It was Patricia Renner. Her voice carried the particular neutrality of someone who is conveying significant information and is being careful not to editorialize. "I wanted to update you," she said. "The FBI has moved to the investigative phase. A federal grand jury has been convened. I'm told this is not standard speed. The documentation was apparently exceptionally complete. The agent I spoke with described it as the most organized, unsolicited referral they had received in some time." A pause. "Vesta Resorts has had its assets frozen as of this morning. Craig Mercer was taken in for questioning yesterday afternoon. The Silver Creek development project has been suspended indefinitely pending the investigation." I was standing at the edge of the porch framing when she called, looking at the tree line. I kept looking at it. "There's one more thing," she said. "The scope of the investigation has been expanded to include historical activities of the predecessor entities. That includes the period 2003 through 2007. Another pause. "I've been told informally that a cold case file from November 2005, a vehicle accident in this county, has been flagged for review in connection with the investigation." I said nothing for a moment. "That's not a guarantee," she said. "I want to be clear about that. A flagged review is not a reopening, and a reopening is not a resolution. But it is movement. It is the right people asking the right questions." "I understand," I said. "Your grandfather built something substantial," she said. 22 years of work and it held together. That's not common." I thanked her. I put the phone in my pocket. I stood on the porch framing the deck boards, not yet laid, just the joists open to the ground below, and looked through the framed wall opening that would eventually be a window at the pine trees and the sky and the creek moving in the lower corner of the property, its sound continuous and unhurried. Walter had not lived to see this. He had built the documentation and prepared the land and designed the house and filled a storage unit with the tools and the money and the letters. And then he had died, and the thing he had built had outlasted him, which was exactly what he had intended, which was the most Walter thing imaginable. He had designed for his own absence the way he designed furniture for the joints to hold without nails, for the structure to carry its own weight without constant maintenance, for the whole thing to stand after the person who made it was gone. I thought about what it must have cost. Not the money, not the years. The cost of doing it alone, of watching from a distance as a child grew up and became a soldier, and became a woman living out of her car, and understanding that the distance was the price of the protection, and paying it anyway year after year, without the relief of being known for it or thanked for it or even acknowledged. The cost of that kind of love is not calculable in any currency that exists. It is the kind of thing that can only be answered by not wasting what it purchased. I went back to work. The roof went on in the fourth week with help from Darby and two men from town who had heard through the mechanism of small-town information that requires no deliberate communication that someone was building on the Callaway land and could use an extra pair of hands for the ridge beam. They showed up on a Saturday morning with tool belts and no particular need for explanation. We got the ridge up and the first rafters cut and set before noon. The walls were sheathed, the windows were rough-framed. The porch took shape on the south side, its posts cut from the same pine as the rest of the structure, the whole building beginning to read as a single thing rather than a collection of parts. On a Thursday evening in the sixth week, Mr. Aldridge came by later than usual, just before dark. He had something under his arm wrapped in burlap. He walked to where I was sanding a section of porch decking and held it out without preamble. "Walt left this with me about 2 years ago," he said. Said it was the last thing he finished and he didn't want to keep it in storage. Said if his granddaughter ever came through, give it to her when the time felt right. He paused. Time feels right. I unwrapped the burlap. It was a set of hand planes. 3 of them, a block plane, a jack plane, and a longer joiner plane nested together in a fitted wooden tray that Walter had built specifically for them, each tool in its own shape recess. The handles oriented the same direction, the blades covered with a thin cloth that had been treated with oil. The wood of the tray was walnut dark and close-grained, fitted together without a single visible fastener. I lifted the block plane from its recess. The body was heavy cast iron, the blade set precisely, the handle worn to a perfect fit that was not quite my hand but close to it in a way that made my throat tighten. He had used this. For decades he had used this, and then he had oiled it and set it in a fitted tray and left it with a man he trusted because he believed at some level that there would be someone to receive it. "Thank you," I said. My voice was steady. I was grateful for that. Mr. Aldridge nodded. He looked at the house, at the framed walls and the sheathing and the porch and the beginning of a roof line against the evening sky for a long moment. "Good bones," he said. It was the highest available compliment from a man like that. He meant the structure. He may have meant something else as well. He walked back to his truck. I watched him go. I carried the tray of planes inside through the rough frame door opening and set it on the section of subfloor that would eventually be the kitchen counter. I stood in the main room of the house, no interior walls yet, just the open space between the exterior walls, the roof above it, the subfloor below, the framed openings where windows would go, and I turned slowly, taking in the dimensions of it. And Walter had measured this room precisely for one person to live in comfortably. Not barely and not extravagantly. Comfortably. There was a window on the north wall that would look into the trees. A window on the south side that would catch the morning light and pass it across the floor through the afternoon. The fireplace location was marked in chalk on the subfloor, its flue path planned through a chase in the east wall. I stood in the center of the room and I thought about him designing this. Sitting in some rented room in some small town with his graph paper and his pencil and his technical manuals calculating load paths and rafter spans and footing depths, building a house for a granddaughter he had not been permitted to speak to in over a decade. Designing it so that she could build it herself, so that the act of building it would be part of the inheritance, so that the hands that had learned on his workbench would have something worthy to work toward. He had given me a map. Every letter, every document, every tool in that storage unit a map. Not to a place, to a way of being, to the particular kind of selfhood that comes from making something real with your own hands, from understanding a problem deeply enough to solve it without shortcuts, from choosing deliberately day after day to build rather than to destroy. I had found the territory. The porch boards were dry enough to walk on by the following morning. I went out before dawn with a cup of coffee from the camp stove and sat on the top step and watched the light come up through the pine trees. The creek was audible from here, not loud, just present, a constant underneath everything. The hawk was out early, circling the clearing in the way hawks circle, when there is no particular urgency, when the movement itself is the point. I thought about the road I had been on before the bus to Silver Creek, about the particular exhaustion of surviving without direction, of moving from one temporary situation to the next, in a life that had structure but no purpose to hang the structure on. About the $43 and the worn fatigues and the leather chair in Mr. Finch's office that cost more than every vehicle I'd ever owned. About the version of myself that had sat in that chair and accepted a key to a storage unit in a town she'd never heard of and allowed herself in some small and unacknowledged way to hope. The hum of anxiety that had been my companion for years, the one that had followed me out of service and into the civilian world and into the car and through the shelter systems and back out again, was not gone. I was not naive enough to believe it was gone. But it was quieter here. Not silent, but manageable in a way it had not been manageable before, because now there was something larger than it to orient toward. The work of the hands drove it to the periphery. The weight of the tools in my grip occupied the part of the mind that the anxiety had been living in, and there was not room for both. Walter had known that too, had built his whole life around it. A good joint needs no nails, he had said, and I understood now that he had not been talking only about woodworking. I set my coffee cup down on the step beside me. I looked at my hands. They were different than they had been 6 weeks ago. Harder in the palms, the knuckles roughed from the work, a callus forming along the inside of the right thumb where the plane handle sat. The hands of a person doing something that mattered. The sun came fully over the tree line. The light moved across the clearing in a slow, deliberate progression, touching the walls of the house, filling the window openings with something warm and precise. I went inside. I took the block plane from the fitted tray. I ran my thumb along the blade, which was sharp enough that I could feel the edge before it cut me if I was careful. I found a section of porch board that needed its edge cleaned up, a slight wind in the wood that had developed as it dried, and I set the plane to it. The first stroke was what it always is with a well-tuned tool, a small revelation. The blade took a thin curl of wood off the surface, pale and translucent, and the board beneath it was clean and true. The sound of it was the sound I had been carrying in my memory for 21 years without knowing I was carrying it. That long, clean whisper of steel on grain. I worked the board from end to end. Then I moved to the next one. Somewhere down the dirt road, Darby's truck turned onto the property. I heard the engine, then the door, then his footsteps on the gravel. He appeared in the doorway of the house. No door yet, just the framed opening with 2 coffees and a question on his face that he didn't ask, because he could see that I was working and that the work was going well, and he understood that these were not the conditions under which you ask unnecessary questions. He set 1 coffee on the subfloor beside me. He picked up a hammer and looked at the chalk line for the next section of trim work. "Where do you want me?" he asked. I looked up from the plane. Through the south window opening past the porch in the clearing in the dirt road, the pine trees stood in their permanent indifference to everything human, their roots in the same ground as the footings of this house, their branches moving in a wind that moved through all of it equally. "Same place as yesterday," I said, and we went back to work.